Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining me on the show here today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Austin, for having me on the show.
It is absolutely my pleasure. I came across your work a good while ago, and it's been one of those interviews that I've been kicking around in my head for a bit, and I'm glad that we were able to do it here today. And so, we're going to be talking a little bit about some myths of Catholic history. But I want to start kind of just, in a kind of getting to know you way of, out of curiosity, I mean, you've written very extensively on church history, and you've given kind of special attention to some of the areas that might be perceived as like the roughest areas. We're going to get into a couple of those today. We were actually just talking about a forthcoming book for you that is kind of variations on that theme. And so I'd be curious, what draws you to this work specifically?
That's a great question. I mean, years and years ago now, I read some works by Diane Moxar, who was a Catholic historian, and she kind of wrote in this vein as well. And I found that they were very unique books at the time. I mean, we're talking 90s, I guess, early to mid 90s, maybe even late 90s. I think some of her works came out. But she wrote a book, several books. One, Seven Lies about Catholic History, 10 Dates that every Catholic should know, these kinds of things. And so when I read her books, geared for a popular audience, and they were kind of eye-opening and enlightening for me in terms of how to see history from a Catholic perspective. And I thought that was, since her works hadn't were many years ago. I thought that was an interesting kind of niche area that I could bring forth my love of history and share that with a more popular audience throughout the church. So that's really what kind of took me on that path of writing in this specific kind of myth busting or Catholic presentation of history arena.
I love it. Well, it's a very engaging way to read church history, and I think most of the people that watch my videos won't be the type of people that maybe need the encouragement to get into this because they love this kind of stuff. They're using their free time to watch an hour-long video on church history, right? But I think for so many others who might think like, that sounds like a snooze fest. Why would I read a book on church history? Coming from this angle of, you thought it might be like this, but actually it's like this could be a kind of disarming way to get into it. So I appreciate what you do with that. And today I want to focus on your book, The Real Story of Catholic History, where you debunk 20 centuries of myths about the church. And I think we were going back and forth. It's like 55 myths total in there,
Yeah.
which is a whole
Mhm.
lot. I guess 20 centuries is a lot of time to go over, though. And so I guess before we kind of get into the specifics, and for today we're going to be focusing specifically on kind of the medieval period, because I think that's an often misunderstood area. But I want to ask, just in general, as you're doing this work, and you've been doing it for some time now, do you have a sense of kind of where these myths come from? Like, is it the case that there's often maybe like a kernel of truth, but then it gets distorted or that gets taken in a different direction? Or is it just like fabrications through and through, or for the most part of these myths just coming out of nowhere? Perhaps it's a mix, but I'd be curious, what are some of the trends you see?
Yeah, I think it's that's an interesting question in terms of the origins of some of these myths. I mean, many of them I think share the same kind of origin story, if you will, in terms of they're usually derived or come from some critic, or we go so far in some cases to say enemies of the church. The Catholic Church, generally, but also religion, even, or I guess specifically, and religion generally, and especially the Christian faith more generally. So I think each time period in history, great, comes up with their own kinds of myths or presentations or misrepresentations of history and historical events and persons, depending upon the group that has an animus against the church or against the Christian faith in general. And some of those myths then find themselves into popular literature books, for example, popular stories or popular works of fiction, and many times they find themselves into media presentations, right, movies and other things, and some, frankly, are even taught within academia. I mean, I could tell you the many things that I learned as an undergrad that have now found out later were not accurate. And it's not necessarily, in some cases, I don't want to paint a picture that people misrepresent the events or persons of church history purposefully. I think in some cases that is true, but in many cases, and I think in most cases, it's just people repeating or what they have heard or what they have been taught. And sometimes that's based on whatever the available, academic research is on a certain subject. And then along comes a scholar who looks at information or documents in a different light or a different way, or even rarely uncovers some new document or manuscript that wasn't, but people weren't aware of before. But more often than not, it's manuscripts or documents that we know of, but are now looked at in a different way or looked into for it to answer a different question than they had previously been used for. And then that changes kind of then how that material is presented and understood, or is challenged. So I think there's a lot of growth in these areas. So it's not necessarily always nefarious, although I do think in some cases that is true. But generally speaking, it's just again, people with some form of criticism, of the faith, of the church, and then they find something interesting about a particular topic or history or historical person, and then it's taught and repeated, and many people just hear it, and then they don't know any different. And so it's actually fascinating work for me, because when I give talks in parishes or events or whatnot, or when people say they've read my books, it's encouraging for me that they will come and say, "Oh, I never knew that before. I've never seen it from that perspective," or "I always thought X," right? Fill in the blank. And then to give them that new perspective is gratifying.
I'm sure it is, and especially that idea of, man, like I never looked at it in this way, and you've helped me learn something new. I think for anyone that teaches in some capacity, whether it's through videos, books, or in traditional classrooms, that's the kind of feedback that people want to hear. So I'm glad that that's been the case for you. This is a bit off the cuff here, but I'd just be curious, have you noticed any trends within that? I mean, so you mentioned like there's all these different sources. I'm thinking in terms of, in days gone by, we had like the Jack Chicks of the world, right? Which seems to be less so today. I feel like he's waned in popularity, right? Kind of the approach of like the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon. Like we've cut this, like the types of arguments that fit in little booklets that are, about that big. But are there trends you're seeing now that are kind of maybe, whether it's the topics that people are going to, that, this is kind of the really buzz thing right now, or kind of approaches? I'd just be curious, as you've worked in this and seen it evolve, is there something that you see kind of coming up more now than perhaps it used to?
Yeah, that's so you mentioned Jack Trick. I mean, I grew up in at least part of my time in West Texas, so I was Catholic then. But those were very prevalent documents in that area of the country at the time. I don't know if they still are. I haven't been back to West Texas in forever. But I agree with you. I think your assessment that those kinds of very just polemic, over the top, in your face kind of criticisms are not as prevalent as they used to be. And so, for me, some of the things I see is more, there's a lot, especially in the areas that I focus on. You see a lot of, like in academia, there's definitely no longer an agreement or a holding on to certain myths of the past, right, that we may have been taught as undergrads or before. And then, the subject matters have moved into the Crusades. I know we're going to talk about later, but that's one specific area where there's just been a growth of an amazing amount of scholarship over the last generation or so. But that understanding hasn't, and that information hasn't really filtered to a more popular audience. And so what you see among people who have like a kind of a cursory knowledge of an event or a historical time period, it's still rooted in, what was kind of I think the academic presentation 60 years ago, 50 years ago. And so that's kind of the trend I see, where you're good historians, whether they're Christian, Catholic, or not, it doesn't matter, right? Have an understanding of a certain historical time period, but then that understanding is the popular understanding hasn't caught up to it. And so that's what I run into an awful lot is people who, were taught something 30, 40 years ago now, whenever their last formal education was 20 years ago. And they hold on to that narrative, but the narrative has substantially changed because of some good academic research over the last 40, 50 years. But they've never heard it, right? It's not been presented to them that way in any kind of media presentation or any kind of movie or documentary even. And so part of it, I think, is because some of these older myths are really sensational, and they're, people like the salaciousness of it and the sensationalism of it. And sometimes real history, I mean, I find it always interesting, but sometimes a made up story or narrative is maybe more fun than the real version. So,
Yeah, that it does strike me that at times the made up version makes for a better movie, right? Like, so the Da Vinci Code story of the canon's probably more entertaining, perhaps, than the real story of the canon. I think that goes along with a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today that happen a little later in church history here.
right.
And I think, you mentioned kind of the narratives that surround things. And the first kind of idea I want to look at is something that the narrative is baked into the terminology itself, and that is the Dark Ages. And so we've come to refer to this period of time after the fall of Rome as the Dark Ages, which kind of loads all of this kind of background assumptions about what this period was, particularly that there wasn't a lot of light in it. That it was kind of backwards. It was this step, and we had this kind of peak of ancient pagan society, and then it all kind of goes down until we get to like the Renaissance or something like that. But I'd be curious, at the very outset, and I know you've written a whole book on this, but when people talk about the Dark Ages and they kind of have that assumption that I just laid out, what are they missing? What are they overlooking with that? Today's video is sponsored by Logos. Logos is an online Bible software tool that fundamentally changed the way I read scripture, and it even helped me make one of the biggest theological decisions of my life. I first came across Logos a few years ago when I was studying for my theology degree, and I can truly say I don't know how I would have gotten through my degree without it. It makes in-depth word studies or theological studies or kind of exegetical studies of scripture so much faster and so much easier, and helps you engage with the text on deeper levels. But you don't have to be an academic to get a lot out of Logos. You can be just leading a local Bible study, and you want to go in armed with a little more context, maybe to get some ideas of what's going on in the Greek without actually knowing Greek. Or maybe you just want to do it for your own personal study. In fact, when I was wrestling personally through what does John 6 mean, I turned to Logos. And in that, I was able to go deeper into the passage than I ever would have been able to on my own. Here's how I did it. I would go to the text, and of course, you can read the text, and in my opinion, the text alone, I could go either way. Maybe it's literal, maybe it's metaphorical. But then I began looking at some commentaries. So I pulled up D.A. Carson. I could just have it up right next to the text, see what he had to say. And then I would pull up some Catholic commentaries, see what they had to say. But then, and this is where it gets really interesting, I could go back to the Greek and I could go back to the church fathers. For instance, I could just double click on the word feed or eat on my flesh and see that the Greek word here is trogo. And oh, really interesting. That has a very visceral connotation to it. Little points towards the literal side. But then the real kicker for me was being able to link to all of what the church fathers said on this. It's absolutely insane. Like back in the day, you would have had to spend a lifetime to do this. But now all of it's right there. You just click. Okay, so what does St. John Chrysostom say on this? Oh, interesting. Or what does Ambrose say? Or St. Basil? And all of a sudden, I was overwhelmed saying, wow, being able to see the Greek context, being able to see the best scholarship today, and being able to see what the church fathers have to say about this, came to the conclusion that Christ really is present in the Eucharist. And that level of study was only made possible by Logos. That's honestly only the tip of the iceberg. So if you want to get into Logos, if you want to deepen your Bible study, I've got some links in the description down below. You can use packages that are set up for Catholics, for Orthodox, or for Protestants, whether you want kind of more church fathers, magisterial documents, whatever. You can see it all in there. And if you use those links, and please do, you will get a discount that will make it cheaper than otherwise. And not only will you get a great discount, but I'll get some support from that as well. So if you want 10% off anything there, or even more off some of their main packages, use the links down in the description. Well, thanks, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, they're missing quite a lot, right? I mean, that term "Dark Ages" it fits into many of the things we just talked about right before. In terms of it's a sensational, kind of emotive term to use, right? And it fits with a lot of Hollywood presentations of any movie set in the medieval period. Is usually right dark. There's dark lighting. There's dark costuming. It's always muddy. It's always raining. I mean, a lot of these movies take place in England, so sure, maybe it rains. It rains a lot there, but okay. But mud and violence and blood everywhere, and people were uncouth, and everybody's walking around with a turkey leg like at the Renaissance fair and what have you. And with bad table manners and this and that. So there's this emotive, evocative image of what life was like back then, and we miss substantial amounts of things about that period, right? I mean, we forget that the Middle Ages were a period of time, or even the so-called Dark Ages, and there's debate within the academic community as to how we date things and how we classify things as time periods, right? And no historian today of any metal is going to use the term Dark Ages, right? It's still used in a popular setting, but not at all in the academic setting anymore. So, which kind of falls back to what I was talking about earlier, how you see a lot of these things in the academic world now that have moved forward, but hasn't really, the popular area hasn't caught up to it yet. But so we're missing things like parliamentary democracy, right? Is a creation of the Middle Ages. The university system is a creation of the medieval period, right? Massive amounts of growth in architecture, and different styles of architecture and art. And I would even go so far as to, those are kind of the more obvious ones. But one area I think that really we do miss in an understanding of this period is an understanding of the relationship between church and state, especially in the Western part of the world, right? So, with the fall or the collapse of governing authority from Rome at the end of the 5th century through the medieval period, you have the kings and dukes and all this power revolving down onto local ethnic, at the time, Germanic chieftains, and then over time you see the development of these European kingdoms, and then eventually, much later, right, nation states and what have you. But in the West, because I think of that collapse of central governing authority in Rome in the 5th century, and the rise of the church in terms of bishops and the role of bishops in urban areas and in those previously administrative regions of the Roman Empire, especially the Bishop of Rome, you see a struggle in many ways between church and state, right? A tension. I mean, sometimes that's a healthy tension, I like to describe it, and other times it's a more full of violent tension between the two spheres, if you will, between the secular and spiritual sphere. But when we think of the Middle Ages or we think of the Dark Ages, people hear that term, they think of church and state locked together, and the church dictating what the state does and telling what the state to do. And we think, oh, we're so enlightened in our modern era because we have that separation, if you will, right, between church and state. And so the church doesn't tell, religious figures don't tell secular figures what to do. But we miss the fact that was never the case in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period, and in the so-called Dark Ages, that there was this great tension. And it's a uniquely, I think, at least in terms of the history of the church, uniquely Western relationship and outgrowth of that geopolitical situation at the time. So I think that's something that comes out of these ages that we don't recognize and focus on as much, but I think we should.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's an example of really turning maybe some of the myths on its head. Because, in the outline I gave, it was kind of just like a broad idea of these were bad, kind of backwards times. But to really the point of our conversation, people don't just think that these are bad, backwards times, but they seem to lay some of that blame on the church itself. And by talking about the relationship between church and state here, I think you're showing that, it might actually be opposite of what some people are thinking here, of the church's role in all this. But, maybe for those who are blissfully ignorant of the myths that are going on here, it might be worth just saying for a minute, what kind of fault is laid at the feet of the church for this time period? What are some of the specifically Catholic myths about the Dark Ages?
So in terms of what people think about the church during that period of time, like things that the church
Yeah,
did wrong.
I think so. And of course we can correct those. But I
Mhm.
realized that in my initial outline, I might not have given what some of the myths about the church that people are coming to this time period with.
Yeah, so I mean, one I mentioned, just a minute ago, in terms of the church-controlled, society. You had churchmen who told secular rulers what to do, kings and dukes and whatnot. There is this kind of general, I think, pervasive myth in many cases about this time period where the church was this omniscient, omnipotent, autocratic institution, and it was the same in every area of the Western world, and that's not true, right? The relationship between church and secular rulers varied depending on what area of Christendom and Western Europe you're talking about. There's certain myths, that, for example, that the church chain Bibles for in cathedrals or churches because they didn't want people to read, right? Or they want to repeat. They want to have access. People to have access to the Scripture. That's a prevalent one, right? That's still heard. The church was concerned about making sure that everybody believes the same way, and that there's a certain amount of truth to that. So I know we're going to talk about that in a minute, but um, and so because of that, it went out and arrested people for believing differently, and tortured people, and even killed people, by the tens of thousands or even millions by some account, depending on different sources you read. So there's that general sense of, or even, and I'm sure we'll get into this topic too, that the church was concerned about all the infighting that was going on among second, third, and fourth born sons in Europe who couldn't inherit the land of their families. And so, to get them to stop fighting in Europe and causing havoc, they decided to call the Crusades and send everybody off to fight the Muslims in North Africa and the Holy Land. And so, again, certain elements of truth to some of these things, but very much in large part completely historically inaccurate.
Yeah, that's helpful, and I appreciate that. And it does tee up where we're going to go with the rest of this conversation quite nicely. And I want to pivot now to the Crusades. I think the Crusades have had this kind of remarkably long shelf life in the popular imagination of everyday people in the West, just considering how long ago they happened. But they seem to still have an active role in shaping what people think about the church and about Christ, perhaps in general as well there. And so you've already touched on one myth related to the Crusades, this idea that they were essentially born out of this desire of like, what do we do with these second, third, and fourth, fifth sons who are going to fight each other or have all this kind of pent up aggression, however you want to say that. So let's send them off on a crusade. That sounds like a great solution. But another myth that you point out is this idea that the Crusades were driven by a hatred of Muslims. That this was, kind of, and I think when we say something like that, we import all types of baggage that we have now over kind of ethnic wars or wars of religion and whatnot. So I want to start with what do some of these myths, whether that's the second, third, fourth, fifth born son myth, or perhaps more specifically this idea of the Crusades were born out of a hatred for Muslims, what does that get wrong?
Yeah, so it gets wrong many different things, right? Just before I answer the question directly, I think it's important, and I try to emphasize this when I teach and when I give presentations and in my writing, is that we have to understand historical events from the perspective of those who participated in them, who lived through them. That's hard for us to do because we have to we have to get out of ourselves, if you will, and kind of get out of our modern mindset and put ourselves into a mindset that may be radically different from our own. But I think that's the most effective way to truly understand these historical events. Doesn't mean we agree with them or that we justify them or whatever, but it helps us to explain them and understand why people acted the way that they did, centuries and centuries ago. And so in the case of the Crusades, I think it's important for us to very, very important for us to get into the mindset of medieval people and their relationship with Christ, their relationship with the church and the society that they had, which was, very much linked and integral in the faith, in the Christian faith, the Catholic faith. That's not to say that everybody there, was a perfect Catholic or perfect Christian. Obviously, that's not true. It's not true in any age, right? Definitely not true now. But people aren't that much different. But they did understand, their society in a much different way. And so, you do see at the end of the 11th century, especially with the arrival of the Seljuk Turks into what was then the Byzantine province of Anatolia, now modern day Turkey, and the pressures that that group of people placed on the Byzantine Empire, if you will, and the request for help that they sent to the West to send what we call crusaders to them. It was the motivation that, at least for the first crusade, and even we could say for multiple subsequent crusades, the motivation was not hatred. The motivation, frankly, was love. I mean, when you read some of these contemporary accounts, chronicles or charters that these individuals left for us when they sold their land to be able to finance their participation in the crusade, they told us, why they were going. And it was rooted in, I like to describe it as love in three ways, right? The love for God. They literally, truly had a deep and abiding love for Christ and his church. and for God. And, the Pope asked them to go on these expeditions and these campaigns. And for them, that was something that was important and something that was worthwhile to do. Not everybody, obviously, but a large number of people thought that and did that. And for us, I think in some ways, modern people, we struggle with that. We struggle with, really, you made this radical life decision rooted in belief in God and in your adherence to the church. Yeah, they did. That's who they were. That's how they believed in, many of them, most of them, frankly. And then, it was love for God. It was love for their neighbors. So reports had been coming back from the Holy Land, from pilgrims from Europe who had gone to the Holy Land and been harassed, by Muslims. Not to say that always happened. There were times of great peaceful journeys. But in the 11th century, the violence started to increase and harassment started to increase. And then even just reports of indigenous Christians, living in the Holy Land who were being harassed. So those reports of that came back to Europe and influenced people to want to go and to help their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, to protect them, from harassment and from violence and from death. And then also love and concern for themselves, right? They were provided this unique spiritual opportunity to participate in this, what they believed and saw as a pilgrimage, and a penitential pilgrimage at that, which had certain spiritual privileges attached to it by the Pope, indulgences. You could go and receive that, and that was a unique opportunity for most of the people at that time. And so, out of a concern for their own salvation and love for themselves, we could say in a good way, and love for their eternal souls, they left and went and participated in these things. So it wasn't really rooted in hatred of Islam. It was, rooted in love for Christ, love for the church, love for their neighbor, love for themselves, and concern for their own salvation. Recognizing, obviously, that, Muslims or Islam was, the enemy, if you will, or the people who were occupying, in their minds, ancient Christian territory. And so it was their job and their opportunity, if you will, to go and to liberate that.
That's really helpful. You've written another book, one that I admittedly haven't read, but it's titled "The Glory of the Crusades," which I think is a provocative title in some ways, because I think the knee-jerk reaction for most Christians would be to probably use a maybe less exciting kind of word there, maybe like the shame of the Crusades or something like that. And I'd be curious, so when you, obviously, it's part of that's, I imagine, to catch people's attention. But when you say something like the glory of the Crusades, is the glory in the Crusades in their accomplishments, or is it in that motivation that you're talking about there, out of kind of the love for their brother Christians? Just out of curiosity, as someone who hasn't read that book.
Yeah, so great question, and I addressed that question in the book, and so about why I titled the book "The Glory," because you're right, the reaction to it was, in many camps, there was a very emotive and knee-jerky reaction to the use of the word, and yeah, it doesn't. My publisher, I'm sure, didn't mind that it was a little bit, if I'm provocative, sure, but what I meant by that, actually, I use that term specifically for two reasons, really. One is, my understanding is that the Hebrew word that's used for glory of God most often in the Old Testament is the Hebrew word kavod. And my understanding of that meaning is that it means something important or heavy. So heavy in weight or something really important. And so I chose that term, the glory of the Crusades, because I wanted people to understand that the crusading movement, occupied a significant period of time of church history. And it was an integral movement within the Catholic Church for centuries, for, depending on how you want to date it, anywhere from 600 to 700 years. And so, for part of it is a reaction to what you said, a minute ago, about maybe we should call it the shame of the Crusade. Some people might argue, and my counter to that is, well, I mean, no, right? We should. It's not really shameful, but we need to understand. Maybe there's some. Not saying that there weren't events that, or activity or actions that occurred that were shameful, individual crusaders doing crazy, wild things, but that it's because this occupies such a long period in time of church history, and it was so many people were motivated to go on these crusades, and popes for centuries encouraged people to do so. It's incumbent upon us as Catholics today to truly understand what these events were and why people went. So there's an importance behind it. We can't just bury our head in the proverbial sand, if you will, and just say, well, we're just going to ignore those 700 years of church history and say those were bad and just leave it at that. I think that's a cop-out, right? We can't do that. It's not honest. So we have to look at these events honestly. That was one reason I used it. The other reason is from a quote from Hilaire Belloc, who was an English Catholic historian, politician, Renaissance man, did all kinds of fun things, but interesting man in and of himself. But he wrote a book on the Crusades in the 30s, and so he was writing at a time, right, post World War One, in the downfall of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, the establishment of all of these different colonial mandates in the Holy Land. So you had the French in Syria, you had the British in Palestine, and there was a lot at the time. There were a lot of Crusader imagery that was used by these colonial powers in a very victorious sense, right? Oh, like we have returned, to the holy. We've finished what the Crusaders weren't able to do. We're occupying the Holy Land for these kinds of things. And Belloc took great umbrage with that terminology and that imagery. And in his mind, he said, "Yeah, we've returned to this area of the world. We, Europeans have returned to this area of the world, but we returned bankrupt from those who came before us in terms of the gloriousness of their lives and the gloriousness of their motivation, as you mentioned, which was a faith-filled motivation overwhelmingly." And so he was using the term, right, the glory of the Crusades, or the glorious time of the Crusades, as a way to kind of shock his own 20th century world, where people were more secular, or he saw the rise of secularism and a loss of and a lack of faith. And so it's from that quote from Belloc that I also kind of adopted this point, is that I think we can learn a lot from these people who went and why they chose to do that. That they risked life and limb, to go on this very, very, scary, long, adventuresome pilgrimage. So why did they do it? And the simple answer, that I was taught as an undergrad was, well, it was greed, right? It was greed. They were, they wanted money, they wanted land, and that just, when you peel back the onion on that justification, it just doesn't really work. Not to say that there weren't some who thought they were going to get rich by going on crusade. They quickly found out that was not going to be the case, because warfare is expensive no matter what century in which you fight it. So yeah, I think that from the gloriness of it, we can learn who these people were, how they saw themselves, how they saw the relationship to Christ and the church, and we can learn a lot spiritually from them as a result of that.
One of the really interesting things about studying church history, and I think your answer has really brought this out, is to see the gaps in what might have motivated people in the past versus what motivates us today, or what are the things that we take for granted as just simply the way everyone would see things that other people don't share. And oftentimes, C.S. Lewis has that great preface on the Incarnation, where he talks about kind of our blind spots, right? And how history helps us kind of trade our blind spots for others, or see our blind spots that we so often miss by only looking at our times. And I think the Crusades can do that in a way for us to see that these people were maybe motivated by something, if we have a charitable reading of it, that we could ask ourselves, like, are we motivated so strongly by matters of faith to take up such consequential actions? And I think someone could get that out of that, even if they did say at the end of the day, maybe I wish this would have gone slightly differently, or this would have gone slightly differently, but we can still kind of have that charitable engagement and try to learn from the past. And one of the tricky points of learning from the Crusades specifically that I think it would be remiss not to bring up, just given the very diverse nature of my audience, it's almost evenly split between Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox. And so kind of talking to the Catholic and Orthodox dialogue here, it's something that's been a sticking point for a long time and has lived long in the memory. And that is the sacking of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. So for those that aren't familiar, perhaps, what happened here? And maybe, as much as we can answer a question like this, why did it happen?
Yeah, that's so how much time do we have? Is this a 3-hour show? Talk about that. There's a lot going on in the lead up to the Fourth Crusade, and what happens during the Fourth Crusade. But to summarize it, basically, right? So you have, so at this time, just to kind of level set everybody. So you had the Third Crusade had happened. It basically finishes around 1192. It was only partially successful, launched to recover the holy city of Jerusalem, who had been captured again by Saladin, the famous Muslim general. And the three major monarchs of Europe at the time go on this crusade. So they're only partially successful. Jerusalem is still in Islamic hands. And so the Pope at the time, Innocent III, decides he wants to call another crusade to hopefully this one will complete the deal and once again liberate the holy city of Jerusalem. So he calls the crusade. A couple of barons and noblemen in France decide that they're going to take the cross and go. And they decide, well, we're going to follow the same plan as the Third Crusade. We're going to, at least the French and English contingents of the Third Crusade, we're going to sail. We're going to take transport ships and go through the Mediterranean and get to the Holy Land faster. Previous crusades had marched over land. All right, so but the problem is that these are all landlocked French noblemen. They don't have a fleet. They have no ships, so they have to go get those ships. So they decided to send ambassadors down to Italy, and there's really two places they could go at the time, Genoa and Venice, to try to negotiate a contract for merchant vessels or troop transports. And so they end up going to Venice. Venice agrees. But the Crusaders make the fundamental mistake of their entire operation, which influences the rest of the events of the Crusade. And when they enter into a treaty negotiations with the Venetians, they grossly overestimate the number of troops that they thought were going to take the cross, right, and go on this crusade. So they asked the Venetians, they told the Venetians they would have 33,500 troops. They didn't have that number. They didn't have those troops signed up already. They just assumed that they'd be able to get that number. It was really ridiculous that they went that high, but they did. And so Venice decides to suspend their merchant activity for an entire year, right? So they don't do anything except for build this fleet of transport ships for this Fourth Crusade. So a year goes by, and the summer the Crusaders are supposed to arrive in Venice and get ready for transport and bring money with them. And the Crusade noblemen who entered into this treaty, the whole idea how they were going to pay for it was, everybody has to pay their own way, right? So nobody's paying for this except for you, the individual Crusader. So people show up. So they were estimating 33,500. They had less than 12,000 show. So that's a significant problem, right? There's a significant deficit that you have to make up. And so they don't have enough money to pay the Venetians. You can imagine the Venetians are quite angry at the situation, right? We suspended our merchant activity for a year. We basically put our city into bankruptcy, if you will, unless we get money from you. So give us some money. Nobody knew how to, the Crusade noblemen didn't know how to fix that. So the Doge, the leader of Venice at the time, a man by the name of Enrico Dandolo, says, okay, well, I have an idea. So across the Adriatic is this city called Zara, who used to be part of Venetian territory, but now it's actually under the control of the King of Hungary. We want that back. So why don't you come with us, attack that city, capture that city for us, and that'll alleviate your debt. Now, the problem with doing that sounds like a win-win for everybody, but the problem with that is that the city of Zara, the king of Hungary, had taken the crusade vow. He hadn't actually gone on crusade yet, but he'd taken the vow. So his lands were protected by the church, right? So anybody who attacks his lands would be automatically excommunicated. So some crusaders decide to leave once this decision is made. They're like, I'm not going to participate in this, but most went. And they went and they sacked the city of Zara, a Christian city. So already the crusade is massively off its goals and objectives and its issues. A group of French crusaders go to Rome. They apologize to Pope Innocent III. He lifts the excommunication of them. The Venetians never did, interestingly enough. So they're excommunicated through this entire time. They're not even really technically crusaders then. Once you've been excommunicated, you are not really technically, legally a crusader anymore. But they didn't care. And so while they're wintering, so this happens, late summer, early fall. So it's not sailing season in the Mediterranean. So they winter over, if you will, in the city of Zara. While they're there, representatives from a Byzantine prince by the name of Alexius Angelus go and meet with the Crusaders and say, hey, we need help because our prince, his father used to be emperor, but he was deposed by his brother. And our prince wants to restore his father and his rightful claim to the throne in Constantinople. So if you go with us and with him to the city and help restore us, he will finance the rest of your expedition to Jerusalem. He will restore union between the eastern and western halves of the church. He'll also give you a contingent of troops to go with you to fight in the Holy Land. Again, win, 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 right? Now, Pope Innocent III, through all this, he hears reports that this Alexius Angelus representatives have come to the Crusaders. He writes a letter to the Crusade leader, Boniface of Montferrat, and says, don't have anything to do with this. Don't participate with this guy. His representatives have been traveling all through Europe trying to get people to help him. Do not do this. Just go to Jerusalem. They don't listen. They go to Constantinople. Long story short, ultimately, they do succeed in putting him on the throne, but there's a palace coup where another a courtier by the name of Bortsophilus decides to get rid of Alexius Angelus and his dad because they brought these crusaders who created kind of havoc around the city. People weren't happy with the presence of these Westerners outside the gates of Constantinople. He couldn't pay all the money that he promised the Crusaders either, so he was doing things like taking jewels off of the icons, or taking sacred vessels. He was opening up the tombs of emperors and taking out jewels and using sacred vessels and melting them down and giving that to the Crusaders in payment. So he wasn't very popular among the people either. So this Murtzopoulos court advisor decides to get rid of Alexius Angelus and his dad. Then he declares himself to be emperor. He's Alexius the Fourth. The Crusaders are upset and angry because the guy who was supposed to give them money, ultimately he gets strangled in jail by order of Alexius IV. So it causes significant problems, and they decide to sack the city. And then they write a letter back to Innocent and say, oh, hey, by the way, we sacked the city and we've established this Latin empire of Constantinople. Isn't everything just great how this all worked out? And the Pope was not happy at all, to say the least. If you read his letters from the time, he was really angry and had very choice and strong words that he wrote in these letters. And so the sacking of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade is in 1204 is probably the most, one of the most infamous episodes of the Crusades. But it's understandable from a certain perspective, not justified at all, obviously. And part of the reason why there's such animosity still between East and West over this is that once the Crusaders got into Constantinople and established that Latin Empire, they did over the years, take many sacred relics and artwork from both secular and spiritual from Constantinople and ship it back west. And so it was a great flowering of this once majestic Christian city. And it was Christian on Christian fighting, which was ridiculous to begin with. It causes problems, as you mentioned, even today. I think the problem with when people talk about this event is that it's usually one or the other, right? I mean, some Orthodox or Easterners like to always blame the West, and Western Crusaders and even the Pope for these events. And I think, more Latin, Roman, Western people tend to just kind of dismiss the Eastern, the Byzantines perspective and say, you shouldn't have invited us in the first place, otherwise they wouldn't have been there, type of thing. So I think there's blame on both sides of the house in this historical event when you look at it. And it's just unfortunate that it continues to have such a negative impact on East-West relations today.
I really appreciated a phrase you put in there of understandable yet not justified. I think that's a really important kind of frame to have as we go through history, is that just because we seek to understand something in its original context doesn't always mean that we're saying, okay, and that means that it was a good thing, just because you can understand someone's motivations here. And I think I really appreciate just kind of the context that you gave for that, and the kind of breadth of perspective that we're getting through that. Obviously, like you said, we could talk about this for hours and hours, and you could write multi-volume works on this alone, but I think that was a wonderful background on what's going on there, and equally perhaps what's not happening there, right? Like that this isn't the Pope saying, hey, go do this, this is going to be great. But that you have a really kind of complicated mess of economic factors going into this, and people acting, thinking they're acting kind of on behalf of the church, when in fact they are not. So I think that was all really helpful. Again, we could dive deep into that, but I want to give a little bit of time, with the time that we have left, to the thing that I don't know if it's second. I would say it's probably only second in infamy to the Crusades, which is the Inquisition, at least from this time period. And so, you write that the Hollywood version of the Inquisition isn't the real story. So what is the real story of the Inquisition? Again, we could do 3 hours on this, but kind of in brief, if someone has the idea that the Inquisition was about the church, like creating this secret police to go around and make sure everyone had all their doctrines checked off correctly and on pain of torture, if that isn't the story, which I think is more or less the Hollywood version of the story, what is the story?
Yeah, I'm glad the Hollywood version of the story is sometimes that Mel Brooks musical, right? The Sing the Song, The Inquisition. Humorous and funny as that skit is, and not historically accurate in many ways. But so what is the Inquisition? Yeah, again, this is one of those topics that's very dense and I think very difficult and multifaceted, frankly. But I also think it's very difficult for a modern audience to truly understand. And so it is really incumbent and important upon us when we talk about this issue or this event, is to delve into, or again, go back to that, trying to understand things from the perspective of those who lived during the times, right? Again, as an understanding and not as a justification for things. But you really can't understand the Inquisition unless, in the that whole outgrowth of this understanding of it, without understanding the how medieval people saw heresy and how they viewed, we live in a, I'll put it this way, we live in a, we've grown up all in a modern pluralistic society where people can have differing opinions, people can believe differently, they can worship differently, which is fine. And then, but that's not the world that medieval people grew up in, right? That's not even remotely their world. They had no comprehension of that and understanding of that. Not to say that there weren't different religious groups within medieval Europe. Obviously, there were Jews and Muslims in certain areas of Christendom, but in many areas there weren't. So it was, in some ways, a very monolithic type of society, at least from a faith perspective. But so again, I mean, the best way to understand this really, and I think the key distinction that people miss when talking about and thinking of the Inquisition is a few things. One, the understanding that heresy in the medieval world was both a secular crime and a spiritual crime. There was an ecclesiastical component or a church component to this, a spiritual component, and a secular/political component to it, right? So from the church's perspective, someone who is engaging in heresy or teaching heresy is a threat to the soul of the faithful, right? So those who are preaching something in error place another person's soul and their own in danger, right? In eternal danger. So from the ecclesial perspective, spiritual perspective, the church wants to help that person, give up that error and embrace the truth for their own good, as a matter of charity, right? Spiritual charity. And so, whereas a secular perspective, secular rulers at the time recognized and knew that heresy always usually results in violence, and it can be popularly motivated violence from people who are just angry at people who are spouting these things, and so it causes unrest. And a secular official is always concerned about peace, unity, security. Right. This has been true throughout the history of the world. This is what a political ruler really wants above all things. And so, from a secular perspective, those who are engaged in heresy were a threat, an active threat. We would use the term national security threat, if you will, to the society, right? And to their job of protecting the society. And so they had a punishment and a crime for the crime of heresy, as did the church. So we have to keep that in mind, first of all, the understanding of heresy and the two elements of it. Then the other thing I think that is also often misunderstood about the so-called Inquisition is that there were really two distinct phases of what we kind of call the Inquisition, and they have very differing histories, although very, in some cases, similar components. So what I mean by that is that the first kind of instance of these inquisitors, these medieval inquisitors, is in the 13th century. So in the 1200s, middle of the 1200s, when you have this rise of, or early 1200s, you have the rise of Albigensianism and Catharism, a heresy in the south of France, right? And so initially, Pope Innocent III tries a preaching campaign to eradicate this heresy. It doesn't work. There's some secular and economic factors associated with these religious factors as well. Ultimately, he calls a crusade that leads to a violent 20-year, basically, civil war within what is modern-day France. But at the end of that, although the political situation stabilizes as a result of the end of the Civil War, the heresy still is in existence. And so the church decides that it needs to the Pope decides he needs to send specially trained theologians to this area to talk to people and to root out this heresy that way. And so you have the institution of the medieval inquisitors, so papally appointed, trained theologians to go and talk to, in areas where heresy was found. Then later on, it's not until really the 15th century where you have the established, and these were itinerant. So these individuals went around to areas wherever there was, heresy present or reported. They weren't, a kind of institution in a certain city or this or that. That happens later. In the 15th century, you have the creation of these institutional tribunals, whom we could properly call the Inquisition in these areas, but they all operated differently from each other, right? So there was one in Rome. There's the most famous of these is the Spanish Inquisition, but they were in other areas of Christendom as well. And they're not linked. They're not necessarily united. They're not all doing the same thing. They have similar procedures and follow certain legal procedures, but they're vastly different, right? In Spain, really, the Spanish Inquisition is an organ of the crown, and is brought forth because of this unique situation in Spain, both politically and culturally, where you have the presence of individuals who come from Spanish or come from Muslim or Jewish backgrounds who convert to the Christian faith, but there was this kind of division in Spanish society between groups of people known as old Christians, or people who had come from families that had been Christian for generations, and then these newer Christians, or these conversos, people who came from Christian or from Muslim and Jewish backgrounds. And so there was this, and many of these newer Christians had become very important, or came to occupy important positions in Spanish society. And so there was some jealousy with the old Christians. And so there was this great cultural tension between these kind of groups in Spain that the crown, again, focused on peace, unity, security, wanted to end. And so it utilized, the crown did, King Fernando and Queen Isabel, used the church and used this Inquisition to try to bring about this unity, right? By rooting out these conversos. So these were people who converted publicly, outwardly, they seemingly were Christian, but inwardly they still practiced elements of the Muslim faith or Jewish faith. And so there was a lot of concern among some of these old Christians and other elements of Spanish society that that was some kind of, fifth column in Spanish society that would open the city gates of whatever invading Muslim army might be coming. So there's a lot of, playing on popular fear and conspiracy theories and stuff like that as well that led to this. So, so I guess that's, in a nutshell, kind of the Inquisition or the Papal Inquisitors. And we have to, the difference between them, these medieval Inquisitors and the institutional tribunals of the Inquisition. But there was never any all-encompassing, monolithic, omniscient, omnipotent institution all throughout Christendom that controlled everybody's religious thoughts, as is commonly understood, I think, with the Inquisition.
That's helpful. That was it in a nutshell really well. I think, maybe if we were to get to what is essentially, I think, the thorniest part of this for people. But I guess before I do that, I'll say I really appreciate, again, the importance of context here. It is so foreign for us who grew up in a kind of multicultural, not just multicultural, but something that is very like multi-perspectival, if you will, religiously, ethnically, all of these things diverse, where we just take it for granted that we have slogans like, diversity is our strength, or these various things that are just kind of in the water, but we probably haven't even really reflected upon. In a similar way, these people would have just taken for granted that diversity of belief wouldn't be your strength, and that, differences of belief are bad for the state. Like, that would have just been kind of natural for them. So as hard as it is for us to wrap our head around that, and whether we agree with that in the end or not, I think it's really important for us to think about that, as you said. But with that being in mind, I think especially given our kind of where we come from, it's the hardest thing for people is kind of reports of torture in this time. I came across Ron Hassner's work on this. He has a great line called bureaucratized torture, relating to the Inquisition, Spanish Inquisition specifically. And what he means by that isn't that like it's this great big machine that you think of with bureaucracy that is torturing everyone, but actually it's pretty methodical and measured in how it's being used. But I think nevertheless, any element of torture is really hard for Christians and Catholics to wrap their head around. So what would you say to those people who, one, have this idea of torture being part of the Inquisition, maybe kind of measuring out in what way and in what way it wasn't, but also like how people ought to think about this if they want to have a charitable Christian perspective on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. That is the kind of the hot button topic of this historical event is the use of torture, or it's the application of torture, or even the availability of torture, we could say, right? So it is important, as you mentioned, to kind of understand the historical context and facts, and separate fact from fiction, because there's a lot of misinformation about torture and the use of torture in these instances. And so many of those involve around the numbers of people that were tortured, why torture was utilized, or if it was even utilized, and the whole purposes behind that. So a couple of things, I think, to kind of level set, right, the situation, understand the context. So the Papal Inquisitors and medieval Inquisitors I talked about earlier in that first phase of this history of the Inquisition, if you will, were established in 1231, and torture as a means that was a tool that was available to inquisitors to utilize during their procedures wasn't approved for them until 1252. So 20 years into, if you will, the initial instance of these inquisitors, that wasn't even available for them, right? So that's an important, I think, note to make, that initially it's not what the church didn't set out to torture, millions of people, or tens of thousands of people, right, at all. So whereas in secular courts, that was a utilized tool and a very common tool to be used in secular courts for secular crimes. So we have to understand that distinction. The other thing is to understand that part of the rise of the inquisitors, if you will, was a legal revolution, and a revolution in terms of understanding legal procedure. So previous to the 12th century, right, in most of places of Europe, both in secular law, if you will, and in ecclesial law, whatever, lack of a better term, there was no established real canon law before then, but you can point to the procedure known as accusatorial procedure. So the way that happened, right, was the state didn't go and investigate, or the church didn't go and investigate crimes. It was by accusation. So if you hurt my brother or killed my brother and I'm angry, I would go to my duke or my secular lord and accuse you of doing that, and then he would call you up and you would swear an oath that you didn't do it, or you would confess that you did, and then some punishment would be given. But if you confessed you didn't and I challenged that, then we could solve that in a multitude of different ways, right? The secular ruler could just make a judgment based on the testimony, who he thinks is accurate, or we could settle it through some kind of ordeal, either that, by combat, or through some other forms of ideal, right? Water ordeal or fire ordeal, other kinds of things. But in the 12th century, there's a revival really of ancient Roman legal practice and legal treatises. And so the church adopts this practice, or many of these ancient Roman legal imperial practices. And so it moves from an accusatorial procedure to an inquisitorial procedure. An inquisitorial procedure is, again, the state or this church goes out and investigates a crime, collects evidence, gets testimony, and then the most important thing that needs to happen in an inquisitorial procedure is confession. Someone has to confess that they have committed this crime, right? They have to admit to it. And so as part of that, torture was seen as one tool with which inquisitors and secular officials could utilize to elicit a confession. And that's gets me to my biggest point here, is how to understand the use of torture. It was used, but why was it used, and how did they see that they were using it? So torture, we tend to think of, when we hear torture, that it was a form of punishment, that people were just brought before, the Inquisition or even secular courts, and because you disagreed with what the church taught, then you were handed over to these hooded monks who just whipped you and beat you and did all kinds of things to you, right? That's the image we have in our minds of what happens, but that's not what happens at all, right? So it was never a form of punishment. It was always utilized as a tool to elicit confession. And it was something that there was very specific restrictions and safeguards and protocols put in place for inquisitors to actually utilize torture. So, for example, it could only be used once during the course of a proceeding. There was a time limit in the Spanish Inquisition. There was a time limit associated with how long the session could last. Certain people were exempted, for example, from torture. So professors, which I'm very happy about, were not allowed to be tortured. Clerics in some cases, pregnant women, the elderly, children, right? These ennobled members of nobility, these were all exempted from torture. You could appeal later on in inquisitorial proceedings. If they said that they were going to torture you, you could appeal that decision. So it wasn't just the whim of one inquisitor. It was a kind of collective decision that was made to be able to utilize that tool. Interestingly enough, the torture methods were, we think of, again, extreme violence on someone, maiming, killing, violent, bloody kinds of things. In fact, torture could not break, any methods used could not break the skin, could not cause any blood to be shed, could not permanently maim or harm someone. They couldn't lose a limb, they couldn't suffer permanent physical damages. Again, this is not at all to justify the use of torture in these proceedings, but it's important to keep the factual context around it so that we understand what this was used for. And many inquisitors, frankly, didn't like to use it. Bernard Guy, who was a very famous inquisitor in the 14th century, wrote a manual on how to be a good inquisitor, and he didn't like using the method, and he didn't necessarily recommend it be used because it was something that he found to be massively ineffective, right? Because anytime anybody confessed under torture, the whole point was to elicit a confession. If someone confessed under torture, then the confession had to be repeated the next day when the person was not being tortured, right? Because it was understood that anything they said during a torture session, they could just confess because they wanted the torture to stop, which is understandable completely. But it had to be a free will confession, and so you were asked again the next day, "Do you believe this?" Right? And what you said yesterday, is that accurate? You still hold to that. So again, not it doesn't make it doesn't justify it, but at least helps us to understand that that is not this wanton use of violence that we kind of associated with. And also one other point to mention, I think is extremely important, is that torture was never performed by any cleric. So no one in the clerical state could perform torture. It was always a member of the secular authority, the secular arm, who performed the actual torture. Now, clerics were present during the torture sessions, including scribes. We have, testimonies, we have transcripts of these sessions that you can read and look at, and so that's how we know about a lot of them, right? But it was never something that was inflicted on by a monk or by a priest or a bishop or anything like that, which we typically kind of see. You Google Inquisition, and especially go under the image, right, option on Google, and that's what you see, where all these images of hooded monks or, salacious priests, smiling as blood is being drawn out of these people, and, these horrible methods. So there's that.
There's that indeed. I want to ask one final question before we get into just our kind of closing rapid fire questions. And that is kind of just I don't know if like pastoral way is the way of saying this, but, kind of just some advice you'd have for people who they're Christians and they come across something in church history that seems scandalizing to them, which I think, the topics we've talked about today are things that are like that, but they'll come across other things. And I think if someone's a Christian for long enough, they'll hear things that have happened or maybe haven't, but at least they hear about things in the history of the church that are really difficult for them to deal with, and they don't know how to make sense of it. Just in general, when people come across things like that, what advice do you have for them in terms of where should they turn to get information, and kind of what posture should they have towards pieces of information they learn about church history that feel really troubling to them? I think that'd be a helpful place to kind of wrap up here before we really start to close.
Yeah, no, fantastic question, and it is something that's is kind of very frequent. People will read something or hear something that will be shocking, will be scandalous, and I mean, for me, church history should never be the events of church history should never be something that leads someone away from the faith, right? And so, or at least that shouldn't be the end result of the interpretation of the event. So, a couple of points, right, to think about is. You read something, hear something, see something, right, in church history that's scandalous or shocking. First of all, I think what we've talked about all through our night here, our time together tonight, is try to understand first the historical context. So just take kind of an immediate just step back from the reaction. Recognize you're having a reaction to an event or a person based on who you are and how you've grown up and the circumstances in which you live. Just recognize that. It's not passing judgment. It's just saying recognize that that's your reaction, and that's fine. But be conscious of it. Then take the next step of like, okay, well, why? Why would somebody do this, or why did this happen? So then, from their perspective, from a contemporaneous perspective, so then begin to investigate that a little bit further. I always recommend too, don't read just one source, right? Don't just read one account. Go to multiple different accounts. Look at different authors. Look at Christian authors, non-Christian authors. How do they address this in their work, right? Don't just read my books, read somebody else's book, get a different perspective. I mean, it's not, that should just, I feel like that should be commonsensical. And this is not to be pejorative to anyone or whatever, but I know it's not, but I feel like it should be, right? I mean, I was raised and trained that way to be critically, to think critically, and you read something in a source. Well, let's verify that source, or let's look at it directly. So try different sources, talk to different people, get different perspectives on it. And then, ultimately you have to come to a source that you trust, and hopefully that source is trustful, right? That the source is not just going to whitewash something in church history, because that shouldn't be. I always like to say that too, is we need to learn about our church's history and the actions of the men and women who've come before us in faith, warts and all. I mean, they were sinners, they were fallen yet redeemed creatures just like us, and so we can learn from them, right? The times they exercised virtue and the time that they didn't, just like we do. And so that's not something to be shameful about, or to be shocked at in a negative way, or a way that leads us down a path that loses our faith, but it's just a recognition that's human nature, right? There's always a human element to the church. I mean, those of us who have faith, we know that there's a divine element to the church as well, but there's most assuredly a human element, and that's what we study mostly in church history, right? And so, the last thing I would recommend, Drew, is just with anything that's scandalous, is at the end of the day, right? As Christians, we hold to the person of Jesus Christ, and so that's my faith. My faith is in Christ. My faith is not in men, right? And so I can be emboldened in my faith by the saints and the men and women who've come before me who lived virtuously. I can also, have my faith shocked, by people who didn't do that. But at the end of the day, I got to root myself back in Christ and realize that I'm following Him, and and His church, and I'm not following this particular saint, or this particular pope, or this particular knight, or this particular whatever. It's Christ.
Well said. Well, Steve, this has been an absolute joy. We'll wrap up here with kind of 4 rapid fire questions that are very uncreatively called the final 4. And these are just kind of one phrase or one sentence answers, perhaps even one word. But the first is just, what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
Yeah, so for me, that's really, as a Catholic, it's the sacrament of confession for me, frankly. I find it to be an antidote to pride, and gives me a focused element of self-reflection in my own life. So for me, that's really what has been very spiritual beneficial for me throughout my life.
I'm glad to hear it. Outside the Bible, what has been the most impactful book on your life?
So it's A Severe Mercy by Sheldon Van Auken.
Very nice.
If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. Yeah.
So if you could give your younger self one piece of advice when you were kind of first setting out on this journey of investigating church history, what piece of advice would that be?
I'm gonna give my younger self 2 pieces of advice if I
okay.
can. Let's do that. They're extra 10 seconds or something. But so 2. One is be more mindful of language studies. So really focus much more on language studies, and take those more seriously, and expose yourself to greater in different languages. So that would be one thing I would like to do. And the other suggestion to my younger self is to one way I guess to put it is to grow a thicker skin. Maybe is to, and what I mean by that is, there's always a critic, and so critics are always going to be people who criticize your work and whatever you do. And younger Steve would be, get an email or some form of criticism and just want to just go nuclear on that person, right? And show them how they're totally wrong and this and that, and write all these, emails and yada yada yada. And older Steve has learned, there's just some hills that just aren't worth dying on, and there's always a critic, and you're not going to change them. And if they felt the need to email you because they're angry at something you wrote, there's probably something else going on in their lives. And so older Steve prays for that person now instead of wants to hammer them over the head with an email.
That is a much better reaction. The final question, it's one I delight in asking all my guests. It centers around the idea that this channel is named Gospel Simplicity, and it's very often pointed out to me that the topics can be a bit on the complex side. So to kind of bring it back to the name of the channel in one sentence, what is the gospel?
Yeah, so the gospel is walking with God in the love and freedom of Jesus Christ. That's how I put it.
Well said. Well, Steve, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Austin. I appreciate it so much. God bless.
Hey, if you enjoyed this video, and well, it seems like you did because you made it this far, maybe you just forgot to and you've left it running in the background, but I think you've enjoyed it, and YouTube thinks you'd enjoy this, so YouTube generally knows everything, so you should probably try that. And if you haven't subscribed, well, you can do that here. And it'd be super cool that if you're enjoying these videos and you want to support the channel, you can go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity in the description down below, and you can support the channel. That'd be awesome.